All right, ready to dive into something deep. Today, it's the murky depths of Loch Ness. We're going to try to separate the monster from the myth, all that good stuff. I've got a whole stack of research here about Nessie and her home turf. Got to admit, I'm already getting chills. How about you, ready to face the legend?
It's a legend that just won't quit, is it? What gets me is, even with all our fancy tech and science these days, this story still has such a grip. Guess our fascination with the unknown never really goes away, huh? And Loch Ness itself, well, it's a pretty mysterious character in all this, too.
Okay, so, for everyone listening, let's set the scene. Loch Ness. It's in the Scottish Highlands, and it's not your average lake. Think 23 miles of deep, dark water. Seriously deep.
Right.
754 feet at its deepest point.
Oh, God, it's deep.
You could fit Edinburgh Castle in there twice and still have room to spare. And get this, it holds more fresh water than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. Just a massive, massive body of water.
Wow, a lot of water and a lot of places to hide, I guess. Makes you think all that depth, all that darkness, it's got to play a part in this whole Nessie thing, right? I mean, think about how hard it would be to see anything down there.
Yeah, like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack's also like pitch blacks. All right, so let's talk about those sightings, the legendary encounters with Nessie. The earliest written record we have, believe it or not, goes all the way back to 565 AD. But for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the official Loch Ness Monster sightings register. Over 1,100 recorded sightings, all carefully documented. That's a lot of potential Nessie encounters.
That's a huge number, yeah. But it's not just any old sighting that makes it into the register. They actually go through and take out the hoaxes, the stuff that's easily explained, like boat wakes or animals that got misidentified. Only the unexplained sightings stay in.
So what we're left with are the sightings that really make you scratch your head and go, huh, what was that? And there have been some recent ones between 1997 and 2022 that have pretty compelling photo and video evidence too. But before we get too carried away with the mystery, we got to talk about Loch Ness itself and why it might be so good at, well, creating monsters.
Right, setting the stage. Loch Ness, it's not just deep and dark. There's a lot more going on there. So first, it's full of peat. Makes the water incredibly murky. Then you've got the mirages. They happen a lot, especially when the weather's calm. And those mirages can totally distort shapes, make things look way bigger than they actually are. And on top of all that, you've got these underwater waves called seiches. They can really mess with how things move around, make them go in unexpected directions.
Hold on, so we've got a super dark, super murky loch with things potentially looking gigantic and moving in weird ways. It's like a recipe for mistaking, well, anything for a monster, isn't it? But gotta ask, before we write it all off as optical illusions and overactive imaginations, what does science have to say about Nessie?
You're right to ask. Always gotta look to the science. There have been some pretty serious attempts to get to the bottom of the Nessie mystery. Back in the 1960s, there were a bunch of expeditions, mostly focused on looking at the loch's surface. They found out that a lot of those classic multi-hump sightings could be explained by, get this, boat wakes.
Makes sense with all the boats going back and forth.
Exactly. And they also noticed that calm weather, which is when you get those mirages, seemed to go hand in hand with more sightings.
So even way back then, they were starting to connect the dots between the loch's environment and how people were seeing things. But they didn't stop there, right? What about sonar? I always think of sonar as the ultimate monster hunting tool.
Yeah, seems like it, right? Straight out of the movies. And sonar did have a big role in the Nessie investigations of the 1980s. Researchers used it to scan the depths, see what was down there, and they picked up a lot of unexplained contacts.
Ooh, unexplained contacts. Now we're talking. Did they ever figure out what they were?
Well, some of them could be explained away. Things like methane gas bubbles coming up from the bottom of the loch, or maybe schools of fish, especially seals. But there were others that just remained a mystery. And then in 2018, a real game changer came along, a DNA study. That really shifted the whole focus of the Nessie search.
Ah, yes, the DNA study. That one made a lot of headlines, didn't it? It seems like every time scientists go digging into the Loch Ness mystery, they just find more questions. So tell me more about this study. What did they actually find, and what does it mean for the Nessie legend?
So this DNA study, they went all out, collected water samples all over the loch, analyzed all the genetic material in there. And one of the big findings, get this, a surprising amount of eel DNA.
So maybe our mysterious Nessie is just, well, a giant eel. Not quite the prehistoric monster we imagined, but I guess it's a possibility, right?
It's definitely on the table. Eels, they live in Loch Ness, we know that, and they can get pretty big. But here's the thing, the study couldn't really tell the difference between, like, A ton of small eels or a smaller number of really, really big ones.
Okay, so we've got eels. We just don't know if they're monster-sized eels. Still a pretty big question mark there. What about the rest of the DNA, though? Did they figure out what it all was?
That's where it gets even more interesting. They were able to ID a lot of it, helped them get a better picture of what all lives in the loch. But get this, 25% of the DNA, totally unidentified.
Wait, a quarter of the DNA? They have no idea what it is. That's crazy. So we've got mistaken identities, we've got plausible explanations, those weird sonar contacts, and now unidentified DNA. It's like every time we get close to an answer, the loch throws us another curveball. So what do the Nessie experts, what do they make of all this?
Well, there are a few folks who've spent years, decades even, studying this whole thing, and they've got some pretty interesting takes.
All right, lay it on me. Who are these Nessie experts?
One of the most respected voices out there, Adrian Shine. He leads the Loch Ness Project. This guy, he's been studying the loch for over 50 years, so he's pretty much seen it all. And after all that research, he's still leaning towards the giant fish theory.
Wow, 50 years. So even with the sonar, the unidentified DNA, he's sticking with a big fish. What kind of fish does he think it could be?
He's looked into a few possibilities. One is the sturgeon. Pretty incredible creature, actually. They can get huge ancient lineage. But here's the catch. Sturgeon, they're migratory, usually live in saltwater. They might come into freshwater to spawn every now and then, but it's unlikely they just hang out in Loch Ness all the time.
So sturgeon, possible but not probable. What about other big fish, though?
Yeah, another contender is the European catfish. They can also get pretty massive. But, same problem as the sturgeon, not native to the UK. Wouldn't really do well in Loch Ness. It's cold, it's deep.
Okay, so those are out. But what about the eel? We've got all that eel DNA floating around. Does Shine think that's our Nessie?
He does think eels are a strong contender, specifically a type called the eunuch eel. These eels, they don't go back to the sea to breed, which means they could, theoretically, stay in the loch, grow to, well, monstrous sizes. But even with all that, the DNA study couldn't say for sure that there are giant eels in there.
It's like we're back at square one. So we've got Adrian Shine, veteran Nessie researcher. He's carefully saying maybe it's a giant eel, but no proof. Who else is in this lineup of experts?
Well, can't talk about Nessie experts without mentioning Gary Campbell. He's the guy behind the Loch Ness Monster sightings register.
Ah, the keeper of the Nessie records. What's his take on all this?
He's pretty convinced that the sightings have got to be something alive, maybe even a whole family of creatures living down in the depths.
Whoa, multiple Nessies. That's a whole other level of mystery.
Right, and he thinks maybe these creatures, they live way down deep and only come up by accident. Maybe because of those seiches we talked about.
Makes sense. If they spend most of their time down in the darkness, explains why we don't see them very often.
Whoa.
What about those recent sightings? Those ones that Campbell says are really interesting. What are they like?
Yeah, there are a few from, let's see, between 1997 and 2022 that he points to. They come from different spots around the loch, and they've got both pictures and videos. Campbell says they're like nothing that's been documented before.
Okay, now that's getting me curious. So we've heard from the scientists, we've heard from the, I guess you could call them the record keeper. But what about the true believers? The folks who've dedicated their lives to finding Nessie?
Well, gotta mention Steve Feltham. This guy holds the world record for the longest Nessie vigil. Dedicated his life to this search, literally. He lives right on the shores of Loch Ness, in a converted mobile library van, no less.
Wow, that's some serious dedication.
Yeah.
What is someone who spent that much time watching the loch? What do they think is going on?
His story is amazing. When he first started out, he was convinced Nessie was a plesiosaur, that prehistoric marine reptile. But as the years went by, his thinking changed. Based on his own observations and the sonar contacts that local boat tours were picking up, he started to think that maybe Nessie is a Wells catfish.
Another vote for giant fish. But those sonar contacts, they always seem to add to the mystery. What were they picking up exactly?
There have been a bunch of reports of big sonar contacts way down at the bottom of the loch, especially around a place called Invermoriston. One of them, they described it as being the size of a transit van.
Hold on. A transit van? Hanging out at the bottom of Loch Ness? That's a pretty wild image. So we've got three experts, all different perspectives, but they all seem to be pointing towards, well, a big fish as the most likely explanation for Nessie.
Kind of funny, isn't it? We've got this legend, this mythical creature, captured imaginations for centuries. And all the evidence seems to be saying maybe it's just a really, really big fish.
Like we set the stage for this amazing mythical beast and then a giant fish swings in and steals the show. But there's something kind of cool about that, too. Reminds us that the natural world, it's full of wonder, even if it's not always what we expect. What do you think?
I'm with you on that. I think the real beauty of this whole Nessie thing, it's not just about finding a monster, it's about the search itself. All that science, the research, the dedication, all that human curiosity poured into trying to figure this thing out. It says something about us, how fascinated we are with what we don't know.
And it's not just about the science either, right? Nessie's become this cultural icon, a
Yeah.
symbol of mystery and intrigue, spans generations, countries. It's everywhere. It's inspired all those stories, movies, artwork, even a whole tourism industry around Loch Ness. So where do we go from here? Do we keep looking for Nessie, or do we just accept that we may never really know the answer?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the search, it'll always continue in some form. There will always be people drawn to Loch Ness, hoping to see something incredible. But maybe the focus will shift a little bit.
Shift. What do you mean?
I think we'll start to see less emphasis on finding a monster and more on appreciating the loch itself. How important it is ecologically, how beautiful it is, what it can teach us about the natural world.
I like that. Respecting the mystery, but also taking the time to appreciate everything we've learned along the way. So, for everyone listening, what's the big takeaway here? What can they learn from our deep dive into the Loch Ness Monster?
For me, it's a reminder that we should always approach the unknown with a bit of skepticism, but also with a sense of wonder. Don't dismiss things just because they sound crazy, but be open to the possibility that there might be a simpler explanation than you think.
That balance, right. Awe and critical thinking all mixed together.
Exactly. And even with all our tech, our fancy gadgets, there are still mysteries out there. Who knows what else might be hiding in Loch Ness or in all those other unexplored parts of our planet?
Now, that's a thought that really gets the imagination going. Reminds us that there's so much we don't know, so much left to discover.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The unknown, it keeps us curious, keeps us searching, keeps us pushing the limits of what we thought was possible.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Loch Ness Monster, I think the message is clear. Embrace the mystery, keep an open mind, and never, ever underestimate the power of the unknown. It's what keeps us curious, keeps us exploring.
Perfectly said. And who knows, maybe one day the truth about Nessie will finally come out.
Until then, the legend lives on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Makes you think, doesn't it? What else is out there, hiding in the deep, just waiting for us to find it?
I know. It really makes you realize how much we still don't know about our own planet. And that's what I love about this whole Nessie thing. Gets those wheels turning, makes you ask questions, challenges what we think we know.
Totally. It's a good reminder to stay curious, keep exploring. Who knows what you might find?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the Loch Ness Monster. Hope everyone enjoyed it. Whether you're a skeptic or you're ready to book a flight to Scotland and start searching, one thing's for sure, the mystery of Nessie, it just shows how powerful the unknown can be. Thanks for listening.